In the autumn of 1999, in a small town where everyone knew each other in Tennessee, a young girl suddenly vanished, and authorities were left with nothing. More than 25 years later, one small detail reopened the case, and it uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. The town of Crossville sat quietly on the edge of the Cumberland Plateau. It was the kind of tight-knit community where front doors were rarely locked, where neighbors shared harvests from their summer gardens, and where the local high school football schedule dictated the rhythm of Friday nights. In places like this, law enforcement is usually more about settling property line disputes or helping stranded motorists than dealing with serious crime. And for a long time, the man keeping the peace in this peaceful place was Sheriff Arthur Johnson. Arthur was an imposing man with a gentle voice. He stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that seemed perfectly built for the heavy uniform he wore. To the people of Crossville, he was more than just the sheriff. He was a pillar of absolute stability. People trusted him implicitly, not just because of his badge, but because of his history. Years ago, Arthur had experienced a profound tragedy that endeared him to the entire county. His wife had passed away unexpectedly due to severe complications during childbirth. From that day forward, Arthur had raised his only child completely alone, balancing the heavy demands of his position with the equally heavy duties of a single father. That child was his daughter, Emily. By the fall of 1999, Emily was 18 years old and in her senior year of high school. She was vibrant, fiercely intelligent, and possessed a quiet warmth that made her beloved by everyone who knew her. She had her father's strong sense of justice and her mother's bright, observant eyes. Everyone in town knew Emily. They had watched her grow up sitting in the front pew of the community church, working part-time at the local diner during summer breaks, and riding shotgun in her father's cruiser during local parades. For Arthur, Emily was his entire world. The grief of losing his wife had been immense, but Emily was the light that guided him through those dark years. He was protective, perhaps a bit overprotective at times, but no one could blame him. He had already lost the love of his life. He was not going to let anything happen to his daughter. Emily's life seemed incredibly normal. She was heavily involved in school activities, maintained excellent grades, and was already looking forward to college the following year. She was also dating Jake Sterling, a polite and well-spoken young man who happened to be the son of the local county judge, Thomas Sterling, the sheriff's daughter and the judge's son. To the outside world, they were the perfect hometown couple, deeply woven into the fabric of the local justice system's most prominent families. But on the evening of November 12, 1999, the quiet stability of Crossville was shattered forever. It was a Friday night. The air was bitterly cold, carrying the sharp, damp chill that always precedes the first winter snow on the plateau. Emily had told her father she was going to run a quick errand in town and then meet Jake at the local diner to study. It was a routine she had followed a dozen times before. Arthur, who was wrapping up a mountain of paperwork at the station, simply told her to drive safely and that he would see her at home later that evening. She left the house around 7 o'clock in the evening. She drove her reliable blue sedan, a car Arthur had painstakingly maintained for her so she would never be stranded. The drive to town from their property on the outskirts of Crossville usually took about 15 minutes. But Emily never arrived at the diner. By 8:30, Jake called Arthur's home landline, wondering if Emily was running late. When no one answered, Jake called the sheriff's station. Arthur took the call at his desk. A sudden, cold unease settled in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't like Emily to miss a plan without calling, and it certainly wasn't like her to be unreachable. Arthur immediately grabbed his coat, radioed his deputies, and began retracing the route from his house to the center of town. For the first 20 minutes, Arthur told himself it was just a flat tire, a dead battery, a minor inconvenience. But as his cruiser's headlights cut through the thick autumn fog rolling off the fields, he saw something that made his blood run cold. About 4 miles from his home, Sitting on the gravel shoulder of a dark, rural stretch of County Road 9 was Emily's blue sedan. Arthur threw his cruiser into park, the red and blue emergency lights washing over the abandoned vehicle. He stepped out into the freezing air. The scene in front of him made absolutely no sense. The car's engine was still running. A plume of white exhaust drifted lazily into the night air. The headlights were glaring into the empty woods ahead, and the driver's side door was wide open, swinging slightly on its hinges as the cold wind pushed against it. Arthur drew his flashlight and approached with a heavy, sinking dread. He called out her name, his voice echoing off the dense wall of pine trees, but there was only the low hum of the idling engine to answer him. He looked inside the car. The heater was blasting. The radio was playing softly. On the passenger seat sat Emily's purse, fully intact. Her driver's license, a small amount of cash, and her lip balm were all neatly tucked inside. The keys were still in the ignition. There was no blood. There were no signs of a struggle. The gravel around the tires was completely undisturbed, showing no evidence of hard braking or a secondary vehicle pulling up aggressively. It was as if Emily had simply put the car in park, stepped out into the freezing night, and vanished into thin air. Within an hour, the quiet country road was swarming with law enforcement. Every available deputy, volunteer firefighter, and neighboring county unit was called in. Search dogs were brought to the edge of the woods. Flashlights swept through the dense underbrush for miles. Arthur was frantic, his usual calm demeanor entirely fractured. He coordinated search grids, barked orders into his radio, and personally walked miles of dense forest, refusing to sleep, refusing to stop searching until the sun came up. But as the days turned into weeks, the investigation yielded absolutely nothing. It was a total dead end. Friends were interviewed, Jake was questioned extensively, and the woods were searched multiple times. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. Emily had no reason to run away, no enemies, and no secret life that anyone could uncover. There was, however, one incredibly strange detail from that night, a detail that frustrated investigators endlessly. At exactly 7:42 that evening, roughly the time Emily would have been driving down that dark road, the county dispatch center received a 911 call. Brenda, the veteran dispatcher on duty, answered the call immediately. She asked the standard questions, demanding to know the nature of the emergency, but the line was completely silent. There was no screaming, no crying, no background traffic noise, and no heavy breathing. There was only a faint, continuous static. Brenda stayed on the line for 42 seconds, pleading with whoever was on the other end to make a sound, to tap the receiver, to do anything. When the call finally disconnected, Brenda logged it as an unknown disturbance. In 1999, tracing a brief, disconnected call through the rural telecommunications infrastructure was a slow and imperfect process. By the time they tried to pinpoint its origin, the signal had bounced off a distant tower, and the exact location was lost. The authorities assumed it had been Emily trying to call for help in the moments before she was taken, but with the tape containing nothing but silent static, it offered no clues. It was just a haunting, empty void that mocked Arthur's grief. The case grew cold. The town of Crossville grieved, and Sheriff Arthur Johnson became a hollow shell of the man he once was. He eventually retired, spending his remaining years sitting on his porch, staring out at the road, waiting for a daughter who never came home. Time moves forward, even when justice stands still. Seasons changed, technology evolved, and the heartbreaking mystery of Emily Johnson faded into the dusty archives of the county evidence room. If you enjoy real missing person mysteries like this, please subscribe. It really helps our channel grow. 25 years went by. The world changed entirely. The old cassette tapes and handwritten police logs from 1999 were scheduled to be digitized by the county's new cold case unit, an effort to preserve old evidence before it physically degraded. A young digital forensics technician named Marcus was tasked with transferring the old audio files. He was a quiet, meticulous worker who spent his days wearing heavy headphones, surrounded by glowing monitors and audio mixing boards. When he reached the box labeled Johnson, Emily, 1999, he found the original microcassette that held the silent 911 call. Marcus decided to run the audio through a modern, state-of-the-art artificial intelligence sound isolation program. It was a tool that could strip away tape hiss, reduce background static, and amplify frequencies that the human ear could never detect on its own. He wasn't expecting a miracle. He just wanted a clean digital copy for the archives. He loaded the file, applied the filters, and pressed play. At first, there was the familiar silence. But as the AI stripped away 25 years of analog static, the silence began to break. Marcus frowned, leaning closer to his monitor. He turned the volume dial all the way up. The waveform on his screen, previously a flat, dead line, suddenly showed a tiny, rhythmic spike. It wasn't a whisper, it wasn't a cry for help. Through the heavy, digital silence, Marcus heard the distinct metallic chime of a clock. It was faint but unmistakable. It struck 3 deliberate, resonant notes. Marcus paused the recording. His heart began to race. He ran the isolated sound through an acoustic database, analyzing the specific resonance, the metal composition of the chime, and the timing of the strike. The results came back a few minutes later, and they defied all logic. This wasn't just a random grandfather clock ticking in the background of some stranger's house. The database matched the unique tonal signature to a very specific, rare model of a German mechanical clock. According to local historical records, this specific model of clock was never sold in stores in their region. It was a custom-made piece, and in the entire history of the county, only 3 of these clocks had ever been brought into town. They were custom-ordered, engraved, and presented as exclusive retirement gifts by the former mayor. They had been given to exactly 3 people, 3 high-ranking local police deputies. Marcus stared at the screen, a chilling realization washing over him. The 911 call hadn't been made from a dark, lonely road, and the person who took Emily Johnson hadn't been a stranger. The discovery of that single, faint chime echoing through 25 years of silence was enough to make Marcus freeze in his chair. He knew immediately that he was looking at something much larger than a simple audio glitch. He picked up his desk phone and called Detective Thomas Ridley, the current lead investigator for the county's cold case division. Ridley was a cautious, thorough man who did not believe in coincidences. When he walked into the audio lab and listened to the isolated track, his expression hardened. He recognized the significance of that clock just as quickly as Marcus had. Ridley knew he could not keep this information to himself. He had to show it to the one man who had spent the last 2.5 decades waiting for an answer. The drive to former Sheriff Arthur Johnson's property felt incredibly long. Arthur lived at the end of a winding dirt road, in a modest ranch house surrounded by overgrown trees. When Ridley arrived, he found the old man sitting on the back porch, staring out at the empty fields. Arthur had aged terribly. The broad, commanding shoulders that once carried the weight of the county were now slumped under the heavy burden of unending grief. His hair was completely white, and his eyes carried a permanent, heartbreaking sorrow. Ridley sat down next to him, gently explaining what the cold case unit was doing with the old evidence. Then, he placed a small digital recorder on the wooden table between them. He told Arthur to listen carefully. He pressed play. The sound of the isolated, metallic chime filled the quiet porch. It only played for a few seconds, but the reaction was instantaneous. All the color drained from Arthur's deeply lined face. His hands began to tremble, and he leaned forward, staring at the small black device as if it were a ghost. Arthur's voice was nothing more than a ragged whisper when he finally spoke. He identified the sound immediately. He explained that those specific clocks were commissioned back in the late 80s. They were heavy, brass mantle clocks, given exclusively to 3 of his top deputies to honor their decades of service. The men who received them were Deputy William Barrett, Deputy Richard Harrison, and Deputy Elias Thorne. The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The 911 call from the night Emily vanished was not made from the dark roadside where her car was found abandoned. It was made from a room where one of those 3 unique clocks sat on a shelf, a room belonging to a police officer. One of Arthur's own men had been involved in his daughter's disappearance. The betrayal hit Arthur with a physical force. For 25 years, he had believed a stranger had taken his little girl. Now, he was facing the terrifying reality that the person responsible might have been standing next to him in the search party, carrying a flashlight and pretending to look for her. Ridley immediately pulled the files on the 3 deputies. William Barrett had passed away from a sudden heart attack in 2004. Richard Harrison was suffering from severe dementia and living in an assisted care facility on the other side of the country, unable to remember his own name. That left only one man to question: Elias Thorne. Elias had retired shortly after Emily went missing, stepping away from the force much earlier than anyone expected. He still lived in the county, occupying a small, isolated cabin near the foothills. Arthur demanded to be there when Ridley questioned him. Despite being retired, Arthur's presence still carried massive authority, and Ridley agreed, thinking the emotional weight of a grieving father might force Elias to break. The next morning, Ridley and Arthur pulled into Elias Thorne's driveway. The property was unkempt, with tall weeds choking the front yard and rusted car parts scattered near the garage. When Elias opened the door, he looked like a man who had not slept peacefully in decades. He was thin, fragile, and deeply anxious. When he saw Arthur standing on his porch, Elias physically stumbled backward. Panic washed over his face. He tried to shut the door, but Ridley quickly stepped into the frame, flashing his badge and demanding to come inside. They sat Elias down at his kitchen table. Ridley did not waste time playing games. He placed the digital recorder on the table and played the chime. He watched Elias carefully. The old deputy closed his eyes, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. He began to shake violently, his hands covering his face as the sound of the clock echoed in his small kitchen. Arthur leaned over the table, his voice shaking with a terrifying, suppressed anger. He demanded to know where Emily was. He demanded to know what Elias had done that night. But Elias just kept shaking his head, sobbing quietly into his hands. He swore he never hurt her. He swore he did not know where she was today. He just kept repeating that he was only trying to help, that he was only doing what he was told. The conversation was going in circles, with Elias refusing to give them a straight answer about the 911 call. While Arthur continued to press the old man, Ridley stood up and began walking around the cramped living space. His trained eyes scanned the room for anything out of place. On a small desk in the corner, sitting under a stack of unopened junk mail, Ridley noticed a green bank ledger. The book was left open. Ridley casually walked over and glanced down at the pages. What he saw immediately caught his attention. For the past 25 years, Elias Thorne had been making a very specific, anonymous financial transfer. On the first of every single month, exactly $2,000 was wired from his modest pension account to a private medical facility called the Oak Creek Care Center, located 2 counties over. The payment started in December of 1999, just weeks after Emily disappeared. Ridley interrupted the interrogation and held up the ledger. He asked Elias who he was paying to keep quiet. Elias looked at the book, his face completely pale, and he finally stopped crying. He refused to say another word. He simply crossed his arms and stared at the floor, shutting down completely. Ridley knew they had their first real lead in decades. He grabbed Arthur, leaving Elias sitting in silence, and they rushed back to the cruiser. The drive to the Oak Creek Care Center took nearly 2 hours. The tension inside the car was unbearable. Arthur was breathing heavily, his hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles were white. The timeline perfectly matched. A secret monthly payment starting right after Emily vanished. A quiet, private nursing facility far away from their hometown. Arthur was convinced he was about to see his daughter. He prepared himself to find a 43-year-old Emily, perhaps injured, perhaps suffering from memory loss, but alive. When they arrived at the facility, Ridley spoke to the head administrator. He showed his badge and requested the patient files connected to the anonymous monthly payments from Elias Thorne's account. The administrator looked confused but complied, leading them down a long, incredibly quiet hallway that smelled heavily of antiseptic and lemon polish. The administrator explained that the account belonged to a patient they only knew as Jane. She had no official identification, no birth certificate, and no known family. She never spoke a word to the staff. The facility had simply accepted the anonymous checks for decades, providing her with food, shelter, and medical care, never asking questions as long as the bills were paid. They stopped in front of room number 12. The door was slightly ajar. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. 25 years of waiting had come down to this single moment. He pushed the door open, his hands trembling violently. Inside the room, sitting in a wheelchair near the window, was a woman looking out at the parking lot. Arthur stepped into the room, tears already falling from his eyes. He softly called out Emily's name. The woman slowly turned her head. Ridley watched as Arthur's expression shifted from overwhelming hope to absolute shock. He stumbled backward, knocking into the doorframe, his face contorted in total disbelief. The woman in the wheelchair possessed the exact same facial structure as Emily. She had the exact same striking, observant eyes, the same curve of her jaw, and the same shape of her mouth. The resemblance was uncanny, almost haunting. It was like looking into a mirror. But it was absolutely impossible for this woman to be Emily. Emily would be 43 years old today. The woman sitting by the window, with her deep wrinkles and thinning gray hair, was clearly in her late 60s. Ridley looked from the woman to Arthur, completely confused. The administrator quickly chimed in, reading from the original intake file from 1999. According to the medical records, this woman was found wandering in the freezing woods just outside of Crossville, completely disoriented and suffering from severe exposure, on the exact same night that Emily Johnson's car was found abandoned on the side of the road. Elias Thorne had quietly arranged for her to be transferred here, hiding her away from the public eye, and had been secretly paying for her care ever since. Arthur began to panic. He started shaking his head aggressively, backing out of the room into the hallway. He told Ridley that this was a mistake. He loudly insisted that this woman was a stranger, that she had nothing to do with his daughter, and that Elias must have been involved in some other crime. He demanded they leave immediately and go back to pressure Elias for the real truth about Emily. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Ridley found Arthur's sudden panic highly unusual. A moment ago, the former sheriff was desperate for answers, but now he was aggressively trying to run away from a massive piece of evidence. The woman looked entirely too much like Emily for this to be a coincidence, especially since she was found in the same woods on the same night. While Arthur paced nervously in the hallway, demanding they leave, Ridley quietly asked the nurse for a favor. He needed a DNA sample from the patient. The nurse discreetly provided a few strands of hair from the woman's silver hairbrush sitting on the bedside table. Ridley carefully placed the sample in an evidence bag and tucked it into his jacket pocket. On the silent drive back to Crossville, Arthur stared out the passenger window, refusing to speak. He looked visibly ill, sweating and chewing on his bottom lip. Ridley drove quietly, his mind racing with 100 different theories. Something was very wrong. The grieving father routine suddenly felt fractured, replaced by a deep, defensive fear. The next morning, Ridley expedited the DNA sample to the state crime lab. He requested a direct comparison between the woman in the nursing home and Emily Johnson's DNA profile, which had been stored on file since 1999. Ridley expected the results to show a familial match, perhaps an aunt or a distant cousin that the family had lost touch with. He thought he was simply establishing a biological connection. 3 days later, the laboratory sent the results directly to Ridley's desk. He opened the sealed envelope, his eyes scanning the dense medical terminology until he reached the final conclusion at the bottom of the page. He read the sentence 3 times, unable to process what he was seeing. The DNA test did not just confirm a distant relation, it confirmed a direct maternity match. The probability was 99.9%. The woman sitting in silence at the Oak Creek Care Center was not Emily. She was Emily's biological mother. Ridley dropped the paper onto his desk, his heart pounding in his chest. The entire foundation of the case had just crumbled beneath him. For decades, Sheriff Arthur Johnson had told the entire town, his friends, his colleagues, and even Emily herself, that his beloved wife had tragically died due to complications during childbirth. It was the tragic backstory that made the town love him. It was the event that defined his life. But it was a lie. Emily's mother had never died in childbirth. She had been alive this entire time. And on the exact same freezing November night that her daughter vanished without a trace, she had been found wandering the dark woods of Crossville, completely hidden from the world by a police deputy. Arthur had built his entire life on a massive, calculated fabrication. Ridley realized with a sickening dread that the old sheriff wasn't just a grieving father looking for his missing child. He was a man desperately guarding a terrifying secret. And whatever Arthur was hiding, it was directly connected to the night his daughter disappeared. Detective Thomas Ridley sat at his desk for a long time after reading the DNA report. The small, sterile office felt suddenly suffocating. He stared at the printed paper, his mind struggling to accept the terrifying reality of what it meant. The man who had wept in his cruiser, the man who had led the town in candlelight vigils for 25 years, was a master manipulator. Sheriff Arthur Johnson had not just lied about a minor detail in a police report. He had fabricated his entire tragic history. He had hidden his living wife away, told his own daughter that her mother was dead, and used the sympathy of an entire county to build an untouchable career in law enforcement. Ridley realized with a sickening clarity that the silent 911 call from Elias Thorne's custom clock room was only a small piece of a much darker puzzle. Thorne was just a pawn, a loyal deputy taking orders from a powerful boss. Arthur was the mastermind, but Ridley knew he could not simply drive to the former sheriff's house and slap handcuffs on him. Arthur still had deep connections. He had the loyalty of the town and the local judges. If Ridley confronted him without irrefutable proof of what happened to Emily, Arthur would easily twist the story, claim he was protecting his mentally ill wife, and slip away entirely. Ridley needed to know exactly how Emily's disappearance connected to her mother's sudden appearance in the woods that same night. To find that connection, Ridley needed more evidence. He grabbed his coat and headed straight back to the digital forensics lab. Marcus was surprised to see the detective return so quickly. Ridley pulled a chair up to the audio mixing board and instructed the young technician to open the file containing the silent 911 call. Ridley explained that if Elias Thorne was in that room and Arthur was involved, there had to be something else buried in that 42 seconds of static. He asked Marcus to strip away the sound of the clock chime, dampen the tape hiss entirely, and isolate the lowest frequency ranges. Marcus nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He applied a heavy compression filter, bringing the background noise floor up while suppressing the prominent sounds. They sat in silence, wearing heavy headphones, listening to the digitized void. At first there was nothing, but around the 20-second mark, A faint, rhythmic thudding emerged. Marcus paused the track, isolated the specific wavelength, and amplified it by several decibels. He played it again. Through the heavy digital distortion, a muffled but distinct sound echoed in Ridley's ears. It was a dog barking, but Ridley, a seasoned investigator who had spent years working alongside the canine units, instantly recognized the specific cadence and pitch. It was not the high, frantic yapping of a neighborhood stray, and it was not the relaxed bark of a family pet. It was the deep, disciplined, aggressive warning bark of a highly trained police K-9 unit. Ridley felt a cold chill run down his spine. He ripped off the headphones and practically ran to the basement archives. He pulled the heavy, dust-covered duty rosters for Friday, November 12, 1999. Crossville was a small department back then. They only had 3 active K-9 units in the entire county. Ridley cross-referenced the dispatch logs for that evening. 2 of those units were on active patrol on the opposite side of town, responding to a noise complaint at a local tavern. They were miles away from the dark country road where Emily's car was found. Only one K-9 handler was off-duty that night. The dog belonged to Officer David Carter. Ridley stared at the yellowed logbook, his stomach tying itself into a knot. David Carter was not just another officer on the force. He was Arthur Johnson's right-hand man. He was the sheriff's most trusted deputy, his hunting partner, and his closest friend. The web of corruption was expanding rapidly. It was not just one rogue deputy hiding a woman in a nursing home. Arthur had involved his most loyal men to execute whatever horrific plan unfolded that night. Ridley immediately pulled Carter's personnel file. He hoped to bring the man in for questioning, to break him just like he had broken Elia's thorn. But the file delivered a frustrating blow. Officer David Carter had died in a single-vehicle car accident 10 years ago. Dead men cannot confess, but Ridley knew that dead men often left a paper trail. He began aggressively digging through every single report, fleet maintenance log, and financial record attached to Carter's name in the months following Emily's disappearance. He was looking for any anomaly, any break in routine. It took hours of scanning microscopic microfilm records, but Ridley finally found something completely out of place. Just 4 days after Emily vanished, during the height of the most massive search effort in the county's history, Officer Carter's official police cruiser was written off as completely unserviceable. The official fleet report claimed the vehicle had suffered a severe electrical engine fire and was beyond repair. It was immediately decommissioned and sent to a local salvage yard to be crushed. Ridley knew how police budgets worked. You do not simply crush a municipal vehicle because of an electrical fire without a massive insurance investigation, especially not in a small, underfunded town. And you certainly do not destroy a police cruiser right in the middle of a major missing person case unless you are desperately trying to destroy physical evidence. Ridley copied the name of the salvage yard from the old invoice. It was located on the outskirts of a neighboring county, far away from the prying eyes of Crossville's local residents. The drive took nearly an hour. The salvage yard was a massive, rusting graveyard of old metal, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Ridley parked his car and walked into the small, oil-stained office. The owner was an elderly man named Silas, whose hands were permanently stained with grease. Ridley introduced himself, flashed his badge, and asked if Silas kept records going back to 1999. Silas chuckled, tapping his temple, and said his memory was better than any filing cabinet. Ridley asked about a Crossville police cruiser brought in by an Officer David Carter. Silas stopped wiping the counter. His expression grew serious. He remembered the car perfectly. Silas explained that cops usually bring official paperwork and wait 30 days for an insurance check to clear before a municipal vehicle is destroyed. But Carter did not do that. Carter brought the cruiser in on a private flatbed trailer in the middle of the night. He paid Silas $500 in untraceable cash to put the car in the compactor immediately, no questions asked. But Sila's revealed something even more disturbing. Carter had made one very specific, very strange demand before the car was crushed. He forced Silas to take a blowtorch and remove the heavy metal trunk lid. Carter told the old man to hide the trunk lid in a back shed and never tell a living soul it was there. Carter promised he would return for it one day, but he never did. Ridley felt his pulse quicken. He asked Silas if the shed was still standing. Silas simply nodded, grabbed a heavy ring of keys, and walked out the back door into the freezing wind. They walked past towering piles of crushed sedans and rusted pickup trucks until they reached a dilapidated wooden shed at the very edge of the property, entirely hidden behind a wall of overgrown weeds. Silas unlocked the heavy padlock and pulled the creaking wooden doors open. Inside, leaning against the damp, moldy wall, was the rusted white trunk lid of a 1999 police cruiser. Ridley thanked Silas and asked him to wait by the office. He pulled a pair of blue latex gloves from his jacket pocket and stepped into the dim, dusty light of the shed. He approached the heavy piece of metal, his heart hammering against his ribs. The exterior white paint was peeling, and the police decals had been scraped off long ago. Ridley turned his flashlight on and examined the interior side of the lid. The heavy gray fabric lining that covered the inner metal frame was loose. Several of the plastic retaining clips had been broken and hastily pushed back into place, as if someone had hurriedly ripped the fabric down and tried to shove it back together. Ridley pulled a pocket knife from his belt. He carefully slipped the blade beneath the edge of the gray fabric and sliced it open. As the old material peeled away, a small, silver object fell from the hidden cavity and hit the dirt floor with a soft metallic click. Ridley dropped to his knees and shined his light on the ground. He picked the object up, his breath catching in his throat. It was a heavy silver ring, a high school class ring featuring a bright blue stone and engraved with the graduation year of 2000. Ridley turned the ring over in his gloved fingers, shining his light on the inside band. Engraved into the silver were 3 simple letters. E.J. Emily Johnson. It was the ring Arthur claimed Emily had left on her bathroom sink the night she vanished. The ring she supposedly never wore when running errands. But here it was, hidden inside the trunk of a corrupt deputy's police car, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Emily had been inside that vehicle. But the ring was not the only thing hidden behind the fabric lining. Ridley reached his hand deeper into the dark cavity of the trunk lid. His fingers brushed against something thick and textured. He grabbed it and pulled it out into the light. It was a large piece of thick, yellowed paper, folded tightly into a small square. Ridley carefully unfolded the brittle paper. It was a highly detailed, hand-drawn map of the county. The ink was faded, but the markings were clear. The map bypassed the main highways and focused entirely on the dense, unforgiving terrain of the Eastern Ridge, a heavily wooded area known for dangerous drop-offs and absolute isolation. Someone had used a red marker to draw a winding path along a forgotten logging road, ending at a very specific set of coordinates marked with a heavy, circled X beside the red X. A small note was written in blue ink. It simply said, "Safe House." Ridley took photos of the map, bagged the evidence, and practically flew back to the station. He completely bypassed his desk and went straight to the county property tax records department. He typed the exact coordinates from the map into the archaic computer system. The search results showed that the specific parcel of land was registered to a holding company called Ridge Management, LLC. Ridley knew how to trace shell companies. He spent the next 3 hours pulling state incorporation documents, unearthing decades of buried financial paperwork. He traced the holding company to a post office box, and from the post office box to a local bank account, and from the bank account to a single original signature on a property deed from 1978. The signature belonged to Arthur Johnson. The sheriff secretly owned hundreds of acres of isolated woodland, a property he had aggressively kept off his official financial disclosures for his entire career. Ridley dug even deeper, pulling old county zoning permits from the late 70s. The permits revealed that a structure had been built on that exact plot of land. It was a small, off-the-grid hunting cabin. The dates on the permits hit Ridley like a physical blow. The documents showed that Arthur had lived in this exact cabin full-time over 30 years ago. He lived there before he moved into town, before he became sheriff, and long before Emily was ever born. If you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Ridley knew that the answers to the entire nightmare were waiting on that ridge. The fake death of Emily's mother, the corrupt deputies, the silent 911 call, and the ultimate fate of Emily Johnson were all tied to that forgotten piece of land. He did not call for backup. He could not trust anyone else in the department, not when the former sheriff had clearly controlled everything for decades. Ridley grabbed his heavy coat, checked his service weapon, and drove out toward the eastern ridge as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the tree line. The drive up the mountain was treacherous. The paved road eventually gave way to broken gravel, and the gravel gave way to deep, muddy ruts left behind by old logging trucks. Ridley drove his cruiser as far as it could go before the dense brush made the path impassable. He parked the car, grabbed his heavy tactical flashlight, and began walking the rest of the way on foot. The woods were terrifyingly quiet. The freezing wind whipped through the bare branches, creating long, shifting shadows as the last light of day disappeared. Ridley walked for nearly a mile, following the exact path drawn in red ink on the old map, his boots crunching loudly against the frozen leaves. Finally, the thick wall of pine trees broke. Sitting in a small, overgrown clearing was a decaying wooden cabin. It looked exactly like a place forgotten by time. The roof sagged heavily, the windows were covered from the inside with thick black plastic, and a rusted chain hung loosely over the front door. It was completely hidden from the rest of the world. Ridley drew his weapon, the heavy metal cold against his palm. His heart hammered furiously in his chest as he stepped onto the rotting wooden porch. He reached out and wrapped his hand around the frozen iron doorknob. The rusted chain snapped under the pressure of Ridley's boot, the heavy metal clattering loudly against the frozen wooden porch. He pushed the decaying front door open, his service weapon drawn and his flashlight piercing the absolute darkness inside. The air in the cabin was stagnant, smelling of deep rot, damp earth, and 25 years of abandonment. Ridley swept the beam of his flashlight across the small, single room. It looked like a time capsule that had been violently left behind. There was a rusted cast-iron stove in the center, a small wooden table covered in a thick layer of dust, and a single, ancient cot pushed against the far wall. The floorboards creaked in protest beneath his heavy boots. Every instinct in his body told him that something terrible had happened in this isolated room. He moved toward the cot, examining the decaying mattress. He used the barrel of his flashlight to lift the edge of the heavy, moth-eaten wool blanket. Tucked neatly between the wooden slats of the bed frame was a small, dark blue notebook. Ridley holstered his weapon. His hands were shaking as he reached down and pulled the book from its hiding place. The leather cover was stiff from the cold, and the pages were yellowed with age. He flipped it open to the first page. Written in perfectly neat, looping cursive was a name that made Ridley's heart stop. This was Emily Johnson's diary. Ridley stood in the freezing silence of the cabin, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the faded ink. He began to read. The first dozen pages were exactly what you would expect from an 18-year-old high school senior. She wrote about her classes, her college applications, and her quiet dates at the local diner with her boyfriend, Jake. She wrote about how much she loved her father, how hard he worked, and how she worried about his health. It was a heartbreaking portrait of a normal, happy life. But as Ridley turned to the final entries, dated just 1 week before her disappearance, The tone of the diary shifted drastically. The handwriting became frantic, rushed, and uneven. Emily had not run away, and she had not been randomly targeted by a stranger on a dark road. She had stumbled upon something she was never supposed to see. According to the diary, Emily had been looking for old photo albums in the crawlspace beneath her father's house. She had accidentally dislodged a loose floorboard, but instead of family memories, she found a massive metal lockbox. Curious, she pried it open. Inside, she did not find old documents. She found hundreds of thousands of dollars in banded, unmarked cash, and underneath the money, she found old official county police evidence bags. Ridley felt the air leave his lungs. He remembered exactly where that money came from. In 1994, a massive armed robbery had taken place at the regional county bank. It was the largest heist in the area's history. The suspects were eventually caught, but the massive sum of stolen cash vanished while sitting inside the Crossville police station's evidence room. The official story, signed and sworn by Sheriff Arthur Johnson himself, was that a localized electrical fire had destroyed that specific section of the evidence locker. The case was eventually closed, and the money was written off as completely destroyed. But it was not destroyed. Arthur had taken it. He had stolen the money, hidden it beneath his own floorboards, and lived a quiet, unassuming life to avoid suspicion. Emily had found the cash. The final entry in the diary was written just hours before she vanished on November 12th. She wrote that she was completely terrified. She realized her father, the man she idolized, the man the entire town practically worshipped, was a corrupt criminal. She wrote that she was going to pack a bag, take the evidence, and drive straight to the state police headquarters to turn him in. She knew she could never look at him again. But she never made it to the state police. Ridley closed the diary, his mind spinning. The timeline suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. Arthur must have realized Emily found the money. He panicked. He called his most loyal, corrupt deputies, Elias Thorne and David Carter, and they orchestrated a massive, fake disappearance to silence his own daughter. But one massive question remained. How did they stop her car that night without causing a crash? There were no signs of a struggle on the road. The tires had not skidded. The gravel was completely undisturbed. Emily had pulled over willingly. Ridley left the cabin, the diary safely secured in his heavy coat pocket. He navigated the treacherous, freezing woods back to his cruiser. As he drove down the mountain, an idea sparked in his mind. He pulled out the original case file and looked at the exact coordinates where Emily's car had been found idling on County Road 9. It was a desolate stretch of road, but it was not entirely empty. About a quarter of a mile through the woods, barely visible from the asphalt, was a single, old farmhouse. Ridley decided he needed to talk to whoever lived in that house back in 1999. He drove straight to the property. It was a modest, slightly run-down home with a large front porch. An elderly woman named Martha Gable answered the door. She looked frail, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, her eyes wide with surprise at the sight of a detective standing on her property. Ridley introduced himself and gently asked if she had lived there 25 years ago. Martha nodded slowly. He asked if she remembered the night Emily Johnson went missing. The reaction was instantaneous. Martha's hands began to tremble. She looked over Ridley's shoulder, scanning the empty country road as if she expected someone to be watching them. She hesitated for a long time. Something was wrong, really wrong. The fear in her eyes was incredibly deep and entirely fresh, as if the events of that night had happened yesterday. Ridley promised her she was safe. He told her Sheriff Arthur Johnson was no longer in power, and he just needed the truth. Martha finally broke. Tears welled in her eyes as she leaned against the doorframe. She admitted she had lied to the original investigators. She told Ridley that she had been sitting on her second-story porch that freezing night, wrapped in a blanket, when she saw a car coming down the dark road. It was a blue sedan, but it did not break down. The sedan pulled over onto the gravel shoulder because a second vehicle had pulled up closely behind it and flashed its headlights. Ridley leaned in. He asked if it was a police cruiser with red and blue lights. Martha shook her head. She said it was not a marked cruiser. It was a heavy, black town car, the kind driven by high-ranking county officials. She watched a man get out of the black car and walk up to Emily's window. Emily seemed to recognize him because she calmly turned off her headlights, opened her door, and got into the passenger seat of the black car. The man then walked back to Emily's car, left the door wide open, and walked away. Martha told Ridley she knew exactly who the man was. She had seen him in the local newspaper 100 times. It was Judge Thomas Sterling. The revelation hit Ridley like a freight train. The county judge, the most powerful legal figure in the district. Sterling was the man whose son, Jake, had been dadding Emily. And more importantly, Ridley suddenly remembered something from the mother's hidden nursing home file. The fake death certificate for Emily's mother, the document that allowed Arthur to pretend his wife had died in childbirth, had been signed and legally authorized by Judge Thomas Sterling. The judge and the sheriff were tied together in a massive knot of historical corruption. Sterling had helped Arthur fake his wife's death decades ago, and in return, Arthur likely shared the stolen bank money. When Emily discovered the truth, she was not just a threat to her father. She was a threat to the entire corrupt foundation of the county. Ridley rushed back to his cruiser, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. If Judge Sterling took Emily from the side of the road, what happened to Jake? Everyone believed the young, handsome boyfriend had simply gone away to college a week after the disappearance, heartbroken and wanting a fresh start. He had never returned to Crossville. But Ridley suddenly saw the terrifying reality. Jake didn't go to college. He disappeared right after his girlfriend did. Jake was the judge's own son, but he had likely started asking too many questions. If Sterling was willing to eliminate a sheriff's daughter to protect his empire, what would he do to his own son if Jake figured it out? Ridley needed to know exactly where the judge had taken Emily that night. He needed a location. He called Marcus at the digital forensics lab and gave him an urgent, strange request. He told Marcus to take the silent 911 tape to the local university, to their advanced acoustics laboratory. He needed the tape played through the absolute best studio monitors in the state. Marcus did exactly as he was told. An hour later, he called Ridley back. His voice was breathless. Marcus explained that beneath the sound of Elias Thorne's clock and beneath the sound of Officer Carter's barking K9, there was a third, incredibly low-frequency sound. It was completely undetectable on standard police equipment. But on the high-end university subwoofers, it was unmistakable. It was the deep, rhythmic, bubbling hum of a two-stroke outboard marine engine. It was a boat. Ridley stared out the windshield of his cruiser, his mind racing. Crossville was completely landlocked. There was no navigable water for miles in any direction. There were no lakes, no deep rivers, and no marinas anywhere in the county. The sound of a boat engine made absolutely no sense. Unless they had left the county. Ridley immediately pulled up the property tax records on his mobile terminal, bypassing Arthur's name and searching the extended Johnson family trust. He typed furiously, his fingers slipping on the cold plastic keys. The search took agonizing minutes, filtering through shell companies and distant relatives. Finally, a hidden property deed appeared on the screen. Arthur's late grandfather had established a private trust in the 1970s. Tied to that trust was a small piece of property located 3 hours north of Crossville, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a private lake house on the edge of a massive, deep-water reservoir. Ridley knew he had found the final destination. The safe house on the mountain was a decoy. The real secret was buried by the water. He didn't sleep. He turned his cruiser north, driving through the pitch-black night, the heat blasting against the freezing air outside. The roads became steeper, winding through dark, treacherous mountain passes. By the time Ridley reached the small, sleepy town bordering the reservoir, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale, cold light over the misty water. He parked near the public boat ramp and walked down to the wooden docks. The air was biting, and a thick fog hung over the lake. A local fisherman, an old man wearing a heavy raincoat, was preparing a small aluminum boat for the morning catch. Ridley flashed his badge and showed the fisherman a picture of Arthur Johnson, asking if the man ever visited the area. The fisherman squinted at the photo and nodded. He pointed a calloused finger toward the center of the massive lake. He said the old cop used to come up here all the time, but he didn't just stay at the shoreline cabin. He owned a small, uninhabited island about 2 miles out in the deep water. The fisherman leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. He told Ridley something that made the detective's blood run entirely cold. For the past 25 years, someone had been taking a boat out to that empty island every single week. Rain, snow, or freezing cold, someone was maintaining a small, perfectly manicured garden right in the center of the remote landmass. No one knew why, and no one ever dared to ask. Ridley looked out across the misty water, staring into the thick fog where the island was hidden. The final piece of the puzzle was waiting in that soil. The truth about Emily Johnson, the corrupt sheriff, and the missing judge's son was finally about to see the light of day. Detective Thomas Ridley did not wait for backup. He paid the old fisherman $50 to borrow his small aluminum boat, stepped into the freezing vessel, and pulled the starter cord. The outboard motor hummed to life, breaking the absolute silence of the misty morning. He steered the boat away from the wooden docks, heading straight into the thick gray fog that blanketed the deep reservoir. The water was incredibly calm, like a sheet of dark glass reflecting the gray sky above. Ridley navigated carefully, keeping his eyes fixed on the GPS coordinates on his phone. After 20 minutes of driving through the freezing mist, the dark silhouette of the uninhabited island slowly emerged from the fog. It was a small, rocky landmass covered in tall pine trees. Ridley cut the engine, allowing the boat to glide silently onto the muddy shoreline. He tied the rope to a heavy tree root, grabbed his flashlight and a small folding shovel from his trunk kit, and began walking toward the center of the island. The fisherman had been telling the truth. Hidden entirely behind a thick wall of natural brush was a small, perfectly maintained garden. In the middle of this forgotten island, surrounded by miles of freezing water, someone had meticulously planted winter-hardy flowers, cleared the weeds, and laid down neat rows of decorative river stones. The dedication it took to keep this small patch of earth beautiful for 25 years was staggering. Ridley dropped to his knees at the center of the garden. The soil here was softer, recently turned and carefully patted down. He took his folding shovel and began to dig. He only had to go down about 2 feet before the metal blade struck something hard. He cleared the dirt away with his gloved hands, pulling a heavy, waterproof PVC canister out of the freezing earth. Both ends were tightly sealed with heavy-duty caps and wrapped in thick layers of waterproof tape. Ridley pulled his pocket knife out and sliced through the tough adhesive. He twisted the cap off and shined his flashlight inside. It was a time capsule. Ridley carefully pulled the contents out and laid them on the cold ground. There was a pair of knitted baby booties, a small silver pacifier, and a sealed plastic envelope containing a single Polaroid photograph. Ridley opened the envelope, his fingers trembling as he slid the picture out into the morning light. The photograph showed 2 teenagers standing in front of this exact lake. It was Emily Johnson and her boyfriend, Jake Sterling. They were both smiling, their faces glowing with a quiet, terrified joy. And resting safely in Emily's arms, wrapped in a pink hospital blanket, was a newborn baby. Ridley stared at the photograph, his mind struggling to process the massive revelation. Emily had not just been a high school student running errands. She had been secretly pregnant. The dates on the back of the photo were marked just a few weeks before she vanished. Suddenly, a memory slammed into Ridley's mind like a physical blow. He thought about the county courthouse back in Crossville. He thought about the young, bright 25-year-old clerk who worked the front desk right outside Judge Thomas Sterling's chambers. Her name was Lee. She had the exact same striking, observant eyes as Emily. She had the same quiet smile. Ridley had seen her 100 times fetching files for the judge, entirely unaware of her own history. Ridley shoved the evidence back into the canister, sprinted to the boat, and drove back to the mainland as fast as the small engine would carry him. The drive back to Crossville was a blur of adrenaline and rising anger. When Ridley walked into the county courthouse, his badge visible on his belt, he marched straight to the administrative desk. Lee was sitting there, typing quietly. She looked up, surprised to see the cold case detective breathing heavily in front of her. Ridley asked her to come into an empty conference room. He did not want to frighten her, but he needed the truth immediately. He sat across from her and gently asked about her family history. Lee looked confused, but she answered honestly. She explained that she did not have biological parents in town. She was told she was an orphan, abandoned at a local fire station in the winter of 1999. She had been quickly and quietly adopted by a lovely local family. Ridley asked to see her official adoption papers. Lee, sensing the heavy gravity in the detective's voice, went to the county archives and pulled her own sealed file. She placed the yellowed documents on the table. Ridley scanned the legal paperwork. At the bottom of the final page, authorizing the emergency, closed adoption and sealing the biological records forever, was a single, bold signature. It was signed by Sheriff Arthur Johnson. Arthur had secretly processed the adoption of his own granddaughter, wiping away her true identity and placing her in a random home to hide her existence. And in a twisted twist of fate, the girl had grown up to work in the very courthouse controlled by the man who had helped destroy her family. Just as Ridley was absorbing the shock of the adoption papers, his cell phone buzzed loudly in his pocket. It was Marcus, calling from the digital forensics lab. Marcus sounded completely out of breath. He told Ridley that the telecommunications company had finally processed the deep archive metadata from the silent 911 tape. They had successfully pinged the exact origin of the call. The call had not come from a cell phone on a dark country road, and it had not come from Elias Thorne's cabin. The metadata proved that the call was hardwired. It originated from the residential landline inside Sheriff Arthur Johnson's own home. Ridley hung up the phone, the final pieces of the puzzle suddenly locking together in his mind with terrifying clarity. If the call came from the house, Emily was at home when the disappearance was staged. The abandoned car on the side of the road, the idling engine, the open door. It was all a carefully constructed theater. Emily never made it to town that night. Ridley left Lee in the conference room, walked down the long, marble hallway of the courthouse, and kicked open the heavy oak doors to Judge Thomas Sterling's private chambers. The judge looked up from his heavy mahogany desk, his face instantly flushing with anger at the intrusion. But Ridley did not give him a chance to speak. He slammed the time capsule photograph onto the judge's desk. Emily, Jake, and the baby. Then he dropped Emily's diary, the adoption papers, and the map to Arthur's secret cabin right next to it. Judge Sterling stared at the evidence, all the color draining from his face. The powerful, untouchable man suddenly looked incredibly old and fragile. He collapsed back into his leather chair, his hands shaking violently. Ridley locked the doors and demanded the absolute truth. He told the judge he knew about the fake death certificate for Emily's mother. He knew about the 1994 bank heist, and he knew Jake didn't just run away to college. Sterling buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, ragged breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. The judge confessed that he had despised Emily. He hated that his son was tied to the sheriff's daughter, especially after he discovered they had a baby in secret. Sterling wanted to completely eliminate the child, to erase the evidence of the relationship and protect his family's perfect political image. He had ordered Arthur to handle the situation, threatening to expose Arthur's bank heist if the sheriff did not comply. But Sterling revealed something that made Ridley's blood run cold. Jake, the judge's own son, was not missing. Jake had secretly turned against his father years ago. Jake had been working as a deep-cover informant for the State Bureau of Investigation, gathering evidence to expose his father's immense corruption and his ties to the stolen bank money. The sheriff was not just hiding Emily from the judge. Arthur was actually trying to protect Jake from Emily. Ridley frowned, confused. He asked why Jake would need protection from Emily. Sterling looked up, his eyes filled with a dark, bitter irony. He explained that Emily had found the stolen money under the floorboards, but she didn't just find the cash. She found documents proving that the bank heist was a massive, coordinated setup between the sheriff and the judge. Emily was fiercely moral. She was furious. She told her father she was going to turn them all in, effectively destroying the sheriff, the judge, and ruining the state's ongoing undercover investigation that Jake had risked his life to build. The silent 911 tape was not a plea for help. It was Emily's desperate attempt to record a confession. She had dialed 911 on the kitchen landline and hidden the phone near Arthur's custom mantel clock, trying to capture Arthur, Elias Thorne, and Officer Carter discussing the stolen money. Arthur had caught her. He realized the phone was connected to dispatch. He hung it up, but the damage was done. The sheriff realized his daughter was a massive liability. He could not bring himself to kill his own child, but he could not let her destroy his empire. So Arthur didn't hide his daughter to save her. He hid her to silence her. He staged the car on the road to make it look like a kidnapping. He handed her over to Judge Sterling, who transported her in his black town car to Arthur's isolated mountain cabin. They locked her away, processed the baby's fake adoption to sever all ties, and created the greatest unsolved mystery in the county's history. Ridley stepped back, the sheer weight of the betrayal making him feel sick. A father had imprisoned his own daughter to protect his stolen wealth. But Ridley suddenly remembered the green ledger on Elias Thorne's desk, the anonymous monthly payments to the nursing home, paying for the care of Emily's biological mother. Elias had claimed he was just following orders. But if Arthur had hidden Emily away and Arthur had faked his wife's death, who was actually funding the mother's care for 25 years? Ridley pulled the financial routing documents from his jacket. He looked at the origin of the funds being deposited into Thorne's account. It wasn't Arthur's money. The cash was coming from a small commercial bank in a neighboring town, deposited in cash by the owner of a local bakery. Ridley left the judge in his chambers, posting 2 trusted state troopers at the door. He got into his cruiser and drove 30 miles past the county line, pulling into the quiet main street of the next town over. He parked in front of a small, warm bakery that smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon. The bell above the door chimed softly as he walked inside. The shop was empty, save for a single woman wiping down the glass display counter. She had deep wrinkles around her eyes, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She looked tired, but her posture was strong. She looked up at Ridley, her hands freezing on the cloth. Ridley did not ask for her name. He simply reached into his pocket and placed the silver high school class ring on the counter, the ring with the initials EJ. The woman stared at the ring. Slowly, tears began to pool in her striking, observant eyes. It was Emily Johnson. She had not died in the cabin. She had survived. Emily poured Ridley a cup of coffee, locked the front door of the bakery, and sat down at a small wooden table. She told him the rest of the story, the final chapter of a 25-year nightmare. She explained how her father and the judge had locked her in that freezing mountain cabin, threatening to hurt Jake and her newborn baby if she ever tried to escape or tell the truth. But Emily was much stronger than they realized. After a year of isolation, she managed to break the rusted chain on the front door. She fled into the mountains, changing her name and building a completely new life in the shadows. But she never stopped fighting for her family. Over the years, she had tracked down Elias Thorne. She knew Thorne was weak and heavily burdened by guilt. She cornered the old deputy and forced him to confess what Arthur had done to her biological mother. When she found out her mother was alive and hidden in a nursing home, Emily took over. She used Thorne as a middleman, sending him the money every month to ensure her mother was safe and cared for, waiting patiently for the day when Arthur's empire would finally crack. Ridley asked her why she never went to the police. Emily smiled, a sad, knowing expression. She told him that in 1999 the police were the criminals. There was no one to trust. She had to wait for the old guard to retire, for the corrupt deputies to fade away, and for someone like Ridley to finally start asking the right questions. She reached across the table and picked up her silver class ring, sliding it onto her finger for the first time in 25 years. She looked at Ridley, her eyes filled with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. She said she was finally ready to go home. The next morning, the town of Crossville woke up to a sight they would never forget. Sheriff Arthur Johnson was sitting on his back porch, staring at the empty fields, when 3 marked state police cruisers pulled up his dirt driveway. Detective Ridley stepped out of the lead car, holding a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. But Ridley was not the one who approached the porch. The passenger door of the cruiser opened, and Emily Johnson stepped out into the morning light. Arthur's coffee mug slipped from his hand, shattering into pieces on the wooden deck. The old man fell to his knees, weeping uncontrollably as the daughter he had betrayed stood over him. Emily did not yell. She did not cry. She simply looked at the man who had destroyed her life, turned her back on him, and watched as Ridley placed him under arrest. By noon, Judge Thomas Sterling was escorted out of the courthouse in handcuffs, walking right past Lee, the granddaughter he had tried to erase from the world. The entire corrupt foundation of the town collapsed in a single day. The investigation was formally closed, but the healing had just begun. Emily was finally reunited with her mother, holding her hand in the quiet room at the Oak Creek Care Center. And in a tearful, heartbreaking reunion at the station, Emily was finally able to hold her daughter, Lee, wrapping her arms around the child she had fought so hard to protect. The story of the sheriff's missing daughter became a legend in the state of Tennessee. It served as a powerful, haunting reminder that corruption can hide behind the most trusted faces, and that a lie, no matter how deeply buried, can never outlast the truth. For 25 years, Arthur Johnson thought he had buried his sins in the dark woods, but he forgot that the truth is like a seed. Even when buried in the darkest, coldest earth, it will eventually find its way into the light.